Hi, everyone, and welcome from UCLA, where we're sitting waiting to see if there'll be an evacuation order, bravely. Dear friends, under better circumstances, we would be gathered together today in Royce Hall to hear this important lecture. Los Angeles has suffered unimaginable trauma, and trauma that is well understood by those who live in Greece, especially by those who experienced the horrors of Mati and other serious fires. We applaud the strength and resilience of our community, and we, like everyone else in Los Angeles, are committed to assisting in every attempt to support our community and rebuild our beautiful city. George Manginis, academic director of the Benaki Museum, sitting here next to me, traveled to Los Angeles in the midst of our fires, and we honor his bravery today in taking this long trip from Athens into the unknown. In the face of the unimaginable, we are insisting on offering this lecture to the public in this manner. The Benaki Museum is our center's most important partner in Greece. Many of you will recall that together with the Benaki Museum, our center offered a collaborative lecture series, Hellenic Together, throughout the COVID shutdown, which impacted all of us in both countries. At that time, many people told me that this series sustained them, offering a welcoming series of lectures by the museum's exceptional curators. I'm happy to have Dr. Manginis by my side again today. The Benaki Museum has been our partner at moments of crisis, but also throughout our most important endeavors in Greece, our large-scale Yeraki weaving project and the publication of this beautiful catalog, which many of you have seen, about woven textiles in the village, have been undertaken with the support of the Benaki Museum, which will also host an exhibition of these materials in 2026. And I'm very grateful for the support of the museum and especially of its publications manager, Dimitrios Arvanitakis, who was of enormous assistance, as well as George, in putting this beautiful volume together, which was published in both Greek and in English. Now, our guest today, our beloved George Manginis, has been academic director of the Benaki Museum since 2018. He has taught and researched Cypriot prehistory, Islamic art and architecture, the architecture and archaeology, I would say, of Mount Sinai, Chinese ceramics, European decorative arts, and the Greek and Armenian diasporas. He has published a number of important studies, including Mount Sinai, A History of Travelers and Pilgrims, China Rediscovered, the Benaki Museum collection of Chinese ceramics, ceramics from Korea at the Benaki Museum, the George Evmarfopoulos collection, about which he gave a fantastic lecture several years ago, and Director's Choice Benaki Museum. He has curated major exhibitions, including the recent reinstallation of the upper floor of the Benaki Museum, a brilliant installation, and has also worked at a number of archaeological excavations. He has substantial archaeological experience. I want to acknowledge personally how important his advice and wisdom has been to my own research and to that of my students. In short, George, I'm so glad. I'm going to cry now. I'm so glad that you're with us today. And I truly hope that you'll be able to visit again. In fact, I insist on it at a moment when people can actually meet you in person and share in the kinds of lively discussions that we've always enjoyed. So I would ask everybody to make sure that you're muted so that we can hear new information about this most interesting topic and most interesting figure in Greek history, Queen Olga. George.
Thank you very much, Sharon. May I ask you to please share the screen? Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us. I would like to thank wholeheartedly Gefira, the international partnership between Simon Fraser University and the UCLA and Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, for the kind invitation to Los Angeles and Vancouver. Beyond sharing some thoughts on a royal portrait at the Benaki Museum, these events give us the opportunity to meet in person, that's what we hoped, and to strengthen bonds that were forged during the pandemic. It was a time when human contact was needed most. An initiative by Professor Sharon Gerstel made it possible for both sides of the Atlantic to rendezvous time and again through the Hellenic Together series of lectures that she just mentioned. Almost 5 years have passed, and we hoped it would be finally possible for me to meet you all, friends here in Los Angeles, in the flesh, and to thank you and Sharon on behalf of all of us at the Benaki for being so close at a difficult time. But it was not to be. Nevertheless, our commitment uh, of the board, of my colleagues, and of me personally is to be close to you in the coming years. There will be difficult and fascinating years building up to the 2028 Olympics here in Los Angeles. And we will work together on this. So thank you. Thank you for having us. Now, and on to the lecture. At most times, oh, sorry, how do I? Yes, good. Which one did you spell? This one, thank you. At most times, work in the museum is not as relaxed and as creative as people think. At most times, we're frantically answering emails and phone calls, filling in funding applications, or shepherding groups of people of all ages and levels of interest around galleries and exhibitions. However, from time to time, a moment of revelation comes. An object that has somehow managed to stay out of focus for a long time takes on a new, intriguing guise, inspires questions, and leads to meaningful connections. Eventually, the object reasserts itself by shedding new light on the past and ideally the present too. These moments of revelation come usually by chance, and it only takes a minute of quiet, and we all know how rare a minute of quiet is in our lives, to embark on the voyage of discovery. Tonight, I shall share with you my voyage of discovery that relates to this radiant portrait of the second Queen of Greece, Queen Olga. Since the year 2000, the portrait hangs at the Benaki Museum of Greek Culture, our flagship annex in central Athens, and it is allocated its very own wall space on the third floor. And even after the new hang of the floor, it sits on the same wall. For years, sweet Queen Olga went unnoticed, just a royal portrait by an unidentified, possibly non-Greek painter of an uncertain date around the late 1860s or in the 1870s, judging by the age of the sitter. As such, in 2021, it was included in the bicentenary of the Greek War of Independence exhibition 1821 before and after, and it was listed in the catalogue. However, a change of placement is often a blessing, and the 8-month stay of the portrait on a different wall allowed closer inspection and set me on the voyage of discovery. During the guided tours around the exhibition, people remarked on the resemblance of beautiful Queen Olga to the iconic incarnation of Elizabeth, Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, best known as Sissi, by the German actress Romy Schneider. The exposed neckline and upper arms, the artfully woven hair, the profusion of pearls, and the physical beauty of both depictions of female royalty are indeed strikingly similar. But even historic depictions of Sissi, like this 1958 portrait by Johann Nepomuk Mayer and this 1869 portrait by Franz Rus the Younger, reveal that the aforementioned characteristics were not just typical of Romy Schneider or Sissi, but of the ways in which a young female royal, an empress, or a queen was immortalized on canvas during the third quarter of the 19th century. An elaborate hairdo, extravagant jewelry, a plunging neckline, frothy lace, and the odd bouquet of flowers or a fan was the formula that signified royal grace, pose, demeanor, and above all, grandeur. But who was Queen Olga, the sitter of the Benaki Museum portrait? She was born Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna of Russia on 28 August 1851 in St. Petersburg, and she was the daughter of Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, brother of Tsar Alexander II. Constantine was an enlightened reformist by Romanov standards and supported the emancipation of serfs and other reforms in the Russian Empire. Olga's mother was a German princess, Alexandra of Saxe-Oldenburg. As a teenager, Olga had lived with her family in Poland, while her father was posted there as regent between 1862 and 1863. At the age of 16, she was married to 22-year-old George, the newly enthroned king of the Greeks. George was Danish. He was born Prince William of Schleswig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg in 1845. Remember Glücksburg, there's too many names here. The wedding between the two took place in St. Petersburg, and it was an important step in legitimizing the hold of the Glücksburg dynasty on the Greek throne. Pay a little bit of attention here because this is interesting religious politics. The reign of the first king of Greece, Otto of Wittelsbach, and of his queen consort, Amalia of Oldenburg, had been marred by both the teething problems of a very young state and by Otto's authoritarian style of rule. It definitely didn't help that a country with a predominantly Orthodox Christian population was governed by a Roman Catholic king, Otto was Bavarian, and by a Protestant queen. Otto had been forced to abdicate in 1862, and the next year, the 18-year-old Danish George, another Protestant, was crowned king of the Greeks. George remained Protestant to the end of his life. So the role that Olga had to play was twofold. On the one hand, she had to produce a brood of healthy children to ensure succession and also good intermarriages to European royal houses. And she performed these tasks with admirable speed and efficiency. The current King of England, Charles III, is actually a great-grandson of Queen Olga. On the other hand, she was Orthodox, and her children were baptized into the Greek Orthodox Church, thus consolidating the new dynasty's emotional and cultural bond with the Greek people. Beyond her breeding and religious duties, Olga was a consummate philanthropist, and she worked with devotion for the foundation and betterment of hospitals, prisons, almshouses, and schools. Her biography by her learned personal secretary, Julia Iulia Carolu, published in 1934, is an exhaustive and exhausting litany of praise for benefactions towards institutions and individuals. Her most lasting legacy is the Evangelismos Hospital, which is still going strong at the very site Queen Olga chose for it, on the foot of the Lycabettus Hill. She also gained notoriety for commissioning from Eolia Karolou, a transcription of the New Testament into the modern Greek language, the Dimotiki. This transcription enraged nationalistic and conservative elements of the Greek political and academic scenes. The Queen's Russian origin made her suspect of pan-Slavic leanings at a time when Greece was setting on a course of collision with Bulgaria over Macedonia. These riots, known as the Evangelika, erupted in November 1901 and were connected directly with another transcription of the New Testament made by a man, Alexandros Pallis, and published in the Acropolis newspaper. Somehow, Olga's and Julia's effort was drawn into the fray, and eventually both transcriptions were pulled out of circulation. Olga's fate was equally adventurous, and her Romanov upbringing, as well as her natural resilience, helped her cope with vicissitudes that befell her during the last 13 years of her life. On 18 March 1913, at an optimistic moment for Greece as it was expanding its territory north into Macedonia and Epirus, King George, her husband, was murdered in Thessaloniki by a dissident, and their firstborn son Constantine ascended the throne. After a period of mourning, Olga traveled to Russia, as she often did in the summertime, to meet with her family, and she was stranded there due to the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Political trouble back in Greece, which resulted in the national schism of 1917, as well as the October Revolution in Russia, troubled the aging Olga, who was one of the few Romanovs to survive the Bolshevik persecutions for 2 years. She returned to Athens in 1920 for the funeral of her grandson, King Alexander. He was the one bitten by the monkey, while Constantine and the rest of the royal family were in exile. After Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, Constantine's nemesis, lost the elections in November 1920, Olga was asked to act as regent until Constantine could return to the throne. His reign did not last long this time either, and after the Asia Minor catastrophe of September 1922, Olga followed her abdicated son to exile in Europe. She died on 19 June 1926 and was buried in Florence. Her remains were reinterred at the royal estate in Tatoi in 1936. This was, in a nutshell, the story of Queen Olga's life, from her early time in St. Petersburg to her happy days as Queen Consort to King George, and to the bitter years of exile connected to her son's tumultuous reign. The radiant portrait at the Benaki Museum is redolent of the idyllic atmosphere of her early life, rather than the troubled events that followed. The quality of painting and the extravagance of its framing make it doubtful that its creator would not have signed it. Obviously, this is a very well painted portrait by a proud artist. The back of the painting yielded no clues as to the authorship. And the corners of the canvas that were hidden behind the oval slip only revealed a sketchy study of a piece of jewelry, possibly a tiara or a necklace, nothing surprising in the case of a queen. However, the most important evidence lay in front of our eyes all the time. A signature, a place name, and a date. It's at the side of the oval as the eye travels up. Although the surname was hard to decipher, The Christian name was easy to read, Elizabeth. A search in artists' dictionaries helped settle on a surname, Jericho. The place was Athens, and the year 1870, when Olga was 19 and George was 25, and he had been on the throne for 7 years. Elizabeth Jerichau was born Anna Maria Elizabeth Lisinska Baumann in 1819 in Warsaw to German parents, Philipp Adolf Baumann, a map maker, and Johanne Friederike Reyer. Her artistic upbringing helped her gain access to the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf in 1838, at a time when very few women were accepted as professional painters, but of course she came from a family of painters. In 1845, she moved to Rome, where she met Danish sculptor Emil Jens Adolf Jerichau. They married the next year when she was 27 and he was 30 years old, and they had together 9 children. For the purpose of raising the children, Elizabeth spent most of her time in Copenhagen, while Emil pursued his career in Rome. He was one of the great neoclassical Danish sculptors of the Golden Era. However, Elizabeth was far from the compliant homemaker. Although she had 9 children, she was also prolific in her output, sensitive to the tastes and demands of the art market, and skillful in building relationships with intellectual, moneyed, and most importantly, crowned clients. She traveled to the Ottoman Empire and Egypt twice, in 1869 to 1870, and again in 1874 to 75. The fact that she was a woman, which had proved challenging in her early steps as an artist in Europe, was advantageous in the Islamic world, as she could socialize and portray women of all classes. And while street sellers, like the woman in this painting, were popular models for male artists too, either in reality or imagination, doesn't matter, access to actual upper-class women in the Islamic world was much, much harder for men, especially men coming from the West. One such upper-class woman was the educated and sophisticated Princess Nazli Zainab Hanem, granddaughter of Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt, the very Ibrahim who almost devastated the Greek Revolution in the 1820s. Nazli was immortalized by Elizabeth Jerichau in a most astonishing portrait, redolent of a sensuality that, if it came from the hands of a male painter, would have caused quite a consternation. Elizabeth's eroticized gaze upon her Oriental subjects has invited scholarly scrutiny in recent years. It has been written upon, but a lot remains to be discussed about her other work, her portraits, especially the portraits of Olga and the royal family of Greece, is one of these topics. Elizabeth was very good at building long-lasting connections with European royals, and Louise of Hesse-Kassel, the Queen of Denmark and mother of King George of the Greeks, was one of them. The painter was also especially close to George's eldest sister, Princess Alexandra, who in 1863 had married Edward, the Prince of Wales, son of Queen Victoria and future ruler of the British Empire. Alexandra introduced Elizabeth to the British royal family, therefore securing an audience with the Queen and several commissions. But also she introduced her to the royal family of Greece. The similarity in pose and demeanor between the portraits of Alexandra on the right and Olga on the left does not only betray the formulaic nature of royal portraiture, as we discussed earlier, but also the clever and economic hand of an artist who deploys the same means to render her sitters both attractive and regal. Once you've done it, you can repeat it easily. Finally, after this breakthrough in the authorship of the Benaki Museum portrait, the time had come for the moment in the life of a museum when a label is changed and indeed enriched. This was now the work not of an unidentified painter, but of Elizabeth Jerichau Baumann, who lived between 1819 and 1881, and it was painted in Athens in 1870. But the label is never the end of the journey, and beautiful Olga had more surprises in store. Elizabeth Jerichau wrote an account in Danish of her Oriental travels, which was published in Copenhagen in 1881, the year she died. In this account, she describes how she had met George in Copenhagen when he was a prince before he left for Athens, and how close she was to the king and to his young queen from the day she set foot in Greece on her way to Cairo in winter 1869. She was actually given a studio within the royal palace, overlooking the Acropolis and in close proximity to the nursery where the children of the royal couple were being brought up. On page 32 of her memoir, she mentions the Benaki portrait. Quote, I had to content myself with painting this lovely, high-born lady like other people, but in rosy silk and flowers. The Acropolis in the background is the only sign of where this beautiful lady has her home. The flowers in Olga's hand are roses, pink and yellow, and we know from her biography that she was particularly fond of the yellow color rose. The memoir also mentions more paintings that Elizabeth executed while staying in Athens. They include another portrait of Olga, quote, in the Greek national costume. This image was acquired by our most gracious Queen Louise, unquote, the Queen of Denmark. The present whereabouts of this portrait are unknown. Also, she made this portrait of the 2-year-old Crown Prince Constantine, who looks positively angelic, very different from the Constantine we see in military uniform in the early 20th century. And another portrait of the 1-year-old Prince George, to whom she keeps referring as Prince Nicholas. There is a Prince Nicholas, but he was born many years later. Finally, she mentions painting a portrait of the king, a reference which is ignored in all bibliography on Elizabeth's Athenian oeuvre. How is it possible that a portrait of King George by the favorite painter of his own mother and his sister has vanished? Elizabeth, in this passage, mentions specifically, quote, the portrait has in its time been exhibited here at Charlottenburg, together with Her Majesty Queen Olga's and the adorable king's children, unquote. Now, at this point of our story, I have to introduce two factors of entropy. The first factor is the long and unexpected absence of Olga from Greece between 1914 and 1920, a period during which politics were embittered and the dynasty suffered a lot, and also her exile between 1922 and her death in 1926. During these chaotic years, a lot of items could have gone missing. The second factor is the 1884 fire, which destroyed Christiansborg Castle in Copenhagen, The only other place outside the royal palace in Athens and the Tatoi royal estate where such portraits could have been stored. So it's not completely surprising that something has vanished. However, I have a suggestion to make for the first time tonight to all of you, and this will be a secret between us. At the State Museum for Art in Denmark, there is an oil sketch by Elizabeth of a young man executed on a rectangular piece of canvas onto which an oval is inscribed. The museum catalogue identifies the sitter as the artist's eldest son, Thorold, because there are three letters inscribed in the portrait, T-H-O. However, there's no other evidence for such an identification. And I would like to propose that the similarity between the young man on the sketch and the depictions of King George from the 1860s is striking. The turn of the head is the same, the parting of the hair, the shape of the face, the pursing of the lips. Now, given the restless nature of George's sittings, Elizabeth keeps on saying that he was fidgeting and he would never sit still and allow her to paint him properly, it is possible that she did several quick sketches for his portrait. And I think this one is one of these sketches, and we can place it across the finished oval of Queen Olga. But the two young royals were not the only good-looking couple that Elizabeth painted in Greece. She also created a pair of paintings of larger size, not on commission, but for subsequent sale. These were commercial paintings. A girl and a boy in traditional costume standing in front of ancient landmarks, basically postcards from Athens, destined for the Orientalist enthusiast. On this instance, Elizabeth recounts in her memoir a fascinating story, a story which offsets her glossy narrative from Athens, which is full of anecdotes about the humility of the royal couple and the nobility of the royal court. Apparently, Georgios, the Greek shepherd in the previous painting, whom she described adoringly as my proud, beautiful model, was one of the bandits who a few months later abducted a group of Italian and British aristocratic travelers. This affair ended tragically for both the abductees and the abducted and brought very big negative publicity upon the country. For those of you familiar with modern Greek history, Georgios was one of the notorious brigands of Dylesi, and his ignominious end on the scaffold tarnished the glorious memory of his male beauty, highlighting at the same time the challenges faced by Greece in its effort to conform to European standards of legality. In 1871, a portrait of Queen Olga, probably the Benaki Museum portrait, as there is no mention to a Greek traditional costume in which Olga was in the other portrait, is exhibited in London. And a glowing review in the art journal ascribes to it the utmost delicacy of treatment and brilliancy of color. However, after this date, after 1871, the portrait vanishes from the records. The next mention we find to an Olga in Pink by Elizabeth Jerikau is in recent studies of the artist and on the website of the Danish State Museum of Art. However, the portrait illustrated in the studies and the website is a completely different portrait. It doesn't look anything like the signed portrait in Athens. The website states, quote, "The painting was possibly made for the artist's great supporters, Queen Rhys and her husband, King Christian IX, and may have been hung in the royal couple's apartment at Christiansborg Palace. The frayed edge on the painting, you can see it's quite damaged all around, suggests that it may have been cut out of the original frame. This may have happened in connection to the castle fire of 1884. This is the castle fire I mentioned earlier. Of course, it would be perfectly feasible for the artist to execute two similar portraits of the Queen, but the painting shown in all contemporary works on Elizabeth Yerikau has nothing to do in quality with the work in Athens. Actually, it is not signed Elizabeth Yerikau at all. It is signed Prosalendi and dated 1868. It is a work by the Corfiot painter Spiridon Prosalendis, who had worked already for the royal couple, and he had made portraits of them, and overall he was working in a much more dour and stiff style of prosopography. Elizabeth reminisces that the king, King George, was playing around, he was toying with a portrait of Olga he did not like by a painter who stays unmentioned in the book. And he eventually slipped it, she says, rolled up into her luggage as she was leaving Athens. So could this be the vandalized portrait that traveled back to Copenhagen with Elizabeth Yerikau, and somehow in the process it got mixed up with her own painting? What the three portraits of the young Queen Olga we have seen so far have in common, and I refer to the hand-colored photograph of her age 16, the portrait by Prosalendis from 2 years later, and the portrait by Yerikau, what they have in common is the pink dress. Olga obviously favored the color, which suited her romantic nature and showed off her fair complexion. As we draw to the end of this lecture, it is high time that we talked about the way in which the painting arrived at the Benaki. And we museum people, we love to talk about provenance. The donor was Mary Karolu, née Stefanou, a lady of good birth who was a friend and supporter of the museum. Mary was lady-in-waiting to another queen of the Greeks, Queen Frederica of Hanover, queen consort to King Paul, the second son of Constantine, who reigned between 1947 and 1964. Frederica is the one leading the dance, the Kalamatiano. She is held up by Paul, and Mrs. Karolu is third. Now, Frederica was and remains a much more controversial figure than Olga, and I shall not expand further on her life or her deeds as queen, and this would probably need a comedic genius to do it justice, and I think Joan Rivers would be perfect. Sadly, the genuinely interesting figure for our study, Mary Karolu, Frederica's lady-in-waiting, has very little written about her. As I was preparing this lecture, my colleagues Xenia Politou and Aliki Tsirialou, curators of the Modern Greek Culture Collection and the Photographic Archives at the Benaki, respectively, came up with a set of photographs from around 1927, taken by the celebrated female photographer Elis Sugulzoglu Seraidari, known as Nellis. And in the wall behind me, very often there is an exhibition of Nelly's work, which Sharon has invited from the Benaki. Now, in these engagement photographs, a coy Mary Karolu is courted by a deliciously old-fashioned and humorist handsome young man who would become her husband, Christophoros Karolu. He is dressed in an officer's uniform, while she wears a 19th century dress, which amazingly survives in the Benaki Museum collection and was included in the 1821 before and after exhibition too. In another solitary portrait, Mary coquettishly toys with her fan, bringing to mind the portraits of Queen Alexandra with a fan and, of course, Queen Olga with flowers by Yerikau. It is Mary who provides the provenance link between Queen Olga and her portrait at the Benaki Museum. She was the daughter-in-law of Julia Carolu, whom we have already encountered as the Queen's personal secretary and biographer. Julia, the mother of Christophoros, was born into a distinguished Athenian family, the Somakis, and graduated from the Arsakion School in 1889. She worked in the 1890s as a teacher before being hired by Olga as a tutor for Prince Christopher and other younger royal children in 1895. In 1900, after Julia's marriage to Nikolaos Karolu, she became the personal secretary to the Queen and remained in this post through thick and thin until Olga's death in 1926. It is remarkable that I have not been able to find much information on either Mary in the 20th century or Julia in the late 19th and early 20th century, although both were high-born women with very public lives. Julia, the teacher, the secretary, the biographer, the translator, was remarkable for her erudition, and if anything, she deserves a biography herself. It was through Julia Carolu that the portrait of Queen Olga in pink passed down to her son's wife Mary and eventually the museum. In 1924, while Olga, after Constantine's death, had settled in Rome, Julia was entrusted with getting out of Greece in utmost secrecy a simple wooden box. It contained several items of magnificent jewelry that we could term the Greek crown jewels. They had been catalogued and photographed a few years earlier by the archaeologist Georgios Ikonomou. The box was labeled 117 and was accompanied by a secret policeman called Briganti. It traveled with additional help from Julia's husband, Nikolaos. On 30 November 1924, the Queen telegraphed to Julia 3 words in English: Briganti safely arrived. The portrait was presented as a sign of gratitude for this delicate mission of smuggling jewelry out of Greece. But it was also a token of the very close bond between Olga, Julia, and all the members of the royal family that she had educated through the years of service. A bond exemplified by the personal items of Olga's which Julia kept and Mary bequeathed to the Benaki. So here we are at the end of this talk about an overlooked work of art indifferently hanging on a museum wall. A portrait of a queen that everybody likened to a beautiful actress that brought to life an eccentric empress. A portrait painted by a pioneering female artist who developed a network of royal connections, including a Queen of Denmark and 2 queens of the United Kingdom, but who was also fascinated by women in situations very different to hers. A portrait passed on to the royal sitter's personal secretary, biographer, and friend, a female educator and scholar who in her turn bestowed it upon her daughter-in-law, immortalized in the bloom of her youth by Greece's preeminent woman photographer, and serving another queen who tried to fit in changing times and failed. Now, you probably noticed that in this voyage of discovery, members of my own sex have played marginal roles as husbands and enablers for an array of exceptional women. How many times in the career of an art historian is it possible to tell the biography of an object, let alone a 19th century object of royal provenance, only through women? Sitters, artists, owners. The lives of some of these women are well documented, whereas others are little known so far. Now, the joy and responsibility to bring these women's stories into focus falls upon a new generation of historians. But for now, I invite you to join me in bidding farewell to Olga, the prettiest queen in pink, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I'm sure all of us were thrilled to have heard it, and I'm sure there are many questions that people have. One question I have right off the bat is the connection to the Benaki Museum between Mary Carolo and the Benaki.
Mary Carolo and the Benaki. Mary Carolo, as a lot of society ladies of her generation, from interwar onwards, was close to the museum. You know, she would go to the museum often, and she was a friend of the museum from the 50s when the Friends opened, and she would go frequently to it. I mean, as I said, there is not much documented, but we know she kept on giving to the museum, you know, and her sister, Penelope Vlangali, I mean, Mary had already given things while she was alive, and her sister made sure that a lot of more things were passed on to the museum after she died. So she was very close to the museum.
So the collection of objects, paintings connected with Olga, do they go beyond the works that you showed us? Are there letters, for example?
Yes, there is a small archive. There's the beautiful folder that I showed you with personal mementos. There are photographs of Olga, of George. There are things like the dress, for example, which are not connected to Olga. They are connected to her family history.
Thanks. There are other questions. I have so many. I could keep going, but I'm
Okay.
sure other people have questions as well. If you could raise your hand or ask in the chat, we'd be happy to look at them.
Yeah, but we can probably go
Scroll down here. Lots of appreciation, lots of appreciation. George, I think you should add detective to your CV.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Renee. Renee Pappas writing from New York. The crown jewels that you mentioned.
Oh,
What
yes.
happened to them? Where are they for
Well,
people listening?
If you Google crown jewels Greece, you'll come across several articles. There is one at the Tatler, where you would expect this article to appear, where you can see a lot of them illustrated. Most of them come from Queen Olga. The 3 strands of pearls she wears, we know from stories in her biography that the Tsarina, the wife of Alexander II, had 4 rows of pearls, but some were not as good quality. So she made just 3 of really fine pearls to give to her niece. And then she was given a lot of diamond brooches, and also an emerald suite, a parure, which is just stunning. And it's still owned by the former Queen of Greece, another Dane, Anna Maria. But the Emerald Suite was not in box 117 because it had been passed to another member and returned to the Greek family later through purchase. So there are a lot of pieces of jewelry. I don't have a list of them. There's diamonds, there's pearls, there are emeralds, and sapphires, as far as I remember. It was a small box, but it's a very funny story how it came out of the country.
There's a question in the chat. Which painting do you think most accurately represents Queen Olga of the three that you showed, or the more?
Yes, well, Yerikaus is highly idealized. She's radiantly beautiful, but also I think she's quite beautified. I think Prosalendi, who shows a little frumpy Olga, is probably closer to the truth if we compare it with photographs we have of hers of a little bit later. But she was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, not in the way that we in the 20th century, 21st century think of beauty, but she had the fair skin, the blue eyes, and the beautiful thick hair, which she kept until the end of her life.
I'm just wondering, because everyone here is going to be obsessively looking for Olga, it's Olga mania will ensue. So tell us about her burial site, and can people, what after the fires in Tatoi, what survives of the burial site?
Well, it's very funny that fire is a theme
Yeah.
in today. The burial. I mean, I went to Tatoi a few days after the Great Fire of 2 years, almost 2 years ago, and the burial site, which is planted with cypress trees, had not they been that much damaged because cypress trees somehow resist the fire. And so you can go and visit it. These are very elegant tombs, just monoliths of marble with crosses, and which show a very highly idealized, almost Gothic sensibility about death, which seems to follow George's romantic ideals. George creates Tatoi with Olga, and there is a very aestheticized vision of how they see the deaths of, she loses at least a child. I don't remember, it's more than one. And then she actually buries her grandson, her son, in Tatoi. So there is this very beautiful aestheticized concept. And she starts building a chapel, which is never finished up there. So if one goes and you can visit these tombs. There's also later members of the dynasty. And beyond the politics of it all, we have to see them as works of art and place them, contextualize them within the 19th century and early 20th century to which they belong.
Can I take you off topic for a moment? And then
Yes,
we have
please.
some other questions. We had a very interesting conversation yesterday about Olga and Olges and what that means in Greece. I don't know if people are aware of that. Maybe you could say something about other works of Olga.
Yes, Olga was very philanthropic, as I mentioned. And one of the things she did, she believed in her 19th century, of course, way in female emancipation, in the ability of women to help themselves and potentially support their families. And she did that through founding various workshops where women could weave or embroider within prisons to begin with. That was one of the first things she did. And then she thought that she should enable all Greek women to have a craft, to be able to do something. And this thing would be to make their own clothes. So at the time, a cutting edge technology in home production was the sewing machine. And it was the hand crank sewing machine. And she uh, imported and made available either for free for the poorest or very cheaply for the rest thousands of sewing machines, which the Greeks, because they had the queen's image on them, came to call them Olgas. The Olga, and so instead of calling it Raptomichani, the sewing machine, they called it the Olga. And it was a brilliant piece of marketing on her behalf, but I think she was sincere in her effort. It wasn't about the marketing. She was born in believing to divine rule, so she didn't really bother herself with being famous.
And I think I mentioned to you, just linked into Iraqi and our weaving project, is that we have letters from the village about girls who went to Athens to submit kilims to competitions that were sponsored by Queen Olga for village women to show their crafts.
Exactly. And sometimes, especially in the early years she had, because she taught so much to people from the provinces, she would use vulgar words, but for a queen, of course, she would try to speak Katharevousa, the archaic Greek, but she would use some village words because she would speak to these simple girls coming from Yeraki, perhaps. Now, someone asks, why is the box labeled 117? We don't know. There were a few boxes that were taken out, and probably they had continuous numbering, and this little inconspicuous box was 117.
Interesting. I think there's another question over here
Yes.
for the myopic people looking at the screen.
Yes. So, can you read?
From Phyllis, can you raise your hand and ask the question or a comment? I think if she's still here. Phyllis Graham. The reference to Prosalendis made me think of the late Dr. Athanasios. Prosalendis, my Athens neighbor on Democracy Street for 4 years. A learned gentleman, Dr. Prosalendis was a direct descendant of the Corfu painters.
Interesting.
And his son is an expert conservator of Greek historic properties attached to the National Historical Museum.
Of course, yes, it's a dynasty, the Prosalendis. He was not, Prosalendis was part of a dynasty of people involved in the arts. That's true.
Now, the daughter Eleni often copied the work of her father. So
yeah,
I wonder if are there lost portraits of the queen that...
There's a lot of portraits of the queen by Greek painters. There's two glorious ones by Spiridon Prosalendis in the Hermopolis town hall, full-length portraits. But the one by Yerikao is by far the one she's most beautiful in. She just, she just looks smashing in that.
And we have comments, Evcharisto, Yoro, and others. Anyone else have comments, raising your hands? Maybe we can recognize you, or you can unmute yourself.
Oh, well, I think, everybody is either happy or asleep. So that's...
Well, we so appreciate you being here. I think we're going to pack up and maybe go off campus where it might be safer. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon into the evening, Renee. It's later for you in New York and even later for people in Greece. Thank you so much for a beautiful pink lecture. I can't wait to go see the portrait. I hope everybody will go to the Benaki to see it. And I can't wait to see the publication of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Goodbye.
Be safe, everyone, and
Be
take care of yourselves. Good night.